Family is supposed to mean safety. The grandmother who raised your parent, who held you the day you were born, who knows your name in a way that goes back further than memory, is supposed to be the person the danger never reaches. She is supposed to be the one sitting at the far end of a long and ordinary life, surrounded by the people she made. But for the women in these cases, the moment came when everything they had built, every child they had carried and raised and watched become a parent themselves, was taken from them in a single act of violence by a single person who had decided that none of it deserved to continue. What they have carried in the years since is not grief in any ordinary sense. It is the specific and permanent weight of having survived something that was meant to take everyone. Today we are covering 10 grandmothers who survived the murder of their families and the weight they have carried forward since. Case 1. Felicia Sanders. On the evening of June 17, 2015, the Fellowship Hall in the basement of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, was arranged the way it always was for Wednesday Bible study. 12 people gathered in a circle of chairs beneath the old building's low ceilings. The space was lit and familiar. Emmanuel, AME, was one of the oldest black churches in the American South, founded in 1816, and its congregation had carried more weight across more history than most institutions that city had ever produced. The people who came to Bible study on June 17th came because they always did. Felicia Sanders was among them. She had been a member of that church for years. The basement room was not a strange place to her. The faces around the table were not strangers. She had sat in that circle many times before. Beside her that night was her son Tawanza, 26 years old, a recent graduate of Allen University, who wrote poetry, cut hair, and moved through his days with the particular warmth of someone who had decided to be genuinely present in the lives of people around him. Also in the circle was Felicia's aunt, Susie Jackson, 87 years old, who had been a member of Emmanuel AME for most of her adult life and had sung in the choir for decades. Her presence in that basement was as unremarkable as the chairs or the light because she had always been there, and Felicia's 11-year-old granddaughter had come along that night, seated beside her grandmother, in what should have been, by every ordinary measure of a June Wednesday, one of the safest rooms in the city. A young white man named Dylan Roof had been in that circle for approximately 40 minutes. He arrived stating an interest in Bible study and was welcomed in, the way Emmanuel AME welcomed people who came seeking something. He sat with the group through the session, his head down, listening, or appearing to listen. Felicia later said she thought he was somebody who had come to seek the word. Nobody in that room had any reason to think otherwise. The Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who was also a sitting South Carolina state senator, had opened the group to him without hesitation. That was what that church did. It had always done that. When the group bowed their heads to close with prayer at the end of the session, Roof stood up and drew a .45 caliber Glock pistol. He opened fire on everyone in the room. Felicia Sanders heard 77 shots. She did not lose count. She would say this number in federal court the following year, with Dylan Roof seated across the room from her, and she would say it without hesitation or qualification. 77 shots in that basement, from someone the group had welcomed as a person looking for God. She heard every one of them. When the shooting began, Felicia grabbed her granddaughter and pulled her down under the table. She pressed the child's face hard against her torso, pushing the girl's mouth into her ribs to prevent any sound from escaping. She later described how forcefully she was pressing, saying she had been genuinely afraid she was cutting off the girl's air. Her granddaughter kept saying she was scared. Felicia held her harder and told her to play dead, and she did not move, and she did not let go. Tawanza Sanders had already been shot when he stood up. He was wounded, and he stood up anyway. He looked at Roof and asked him why he was doing this. He told Roof that none of them meant him any harm. Roof replied that he had to do it because black people were raping white women and taking over the world. He then fired approximately 5 more rounds into Tawanza's body. Felicia Sanders described this sequence at trial in exact terms. She said, "That is when he put about 5 bullets into my son." She said it in a courtroom. She said it as a statement of fact, because it was one. She was lying on the floor beneath the table, her granddaughter pressed against her, when Tawanza died. She has described this on many occasions in the years since, including during her trial testimony and in the impact statement she delivered at sentencing. She said she watched her son take his last breath. She said she saw him come into this world and she watched him leave it. This is the language she chose, and she used it consistently, not as performance but as the most accurate description available to her for what she had experienced. The blood spread warm across the floor around her. She could feel it. She held her granddaughter down and did not move and did not make a sound. Susie Jackson, 87 years old, was in her chair at the table. According to accounts established in the investigation and trial, Ruth paused briefly when he reached her, apparently registering how elderly she was. He shot her anyway. Susie has been a fixture of Emmanuel, AME, for decades. She had come to Bible study that night the way she had come to countless other gatherings in that building across the decades of her membership. She had no warning and no chance, and she was killed in her chair, in her church. The 9 people who died were the Reverend Clementa Pinckney, Cynthia Hurd, a branch manager at the Charleston County Public Library, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lee Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tywansa Sanders, the Reverend Daniel Simmons, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, a speech therapist and high school track coach, and Myra Thompson. The youngest was 26, the oldest was 87. All 9 were black. Ruth had selected Emmanuel AME deliberately and with a stated purpose. He had driven to Charleston from Lexington, South Carolina, carrying extra ammunition in case he needed it. He had prepared for this night. 3 people survived the shooting: Felicia Sanders, her granddaughter, and a woman named Polly Shepard. Before leaving, Ruth told Shepard he was letting her live so she could tell the world what had happened. A friend of Tywansa's later testified that Tywansa had sent him a Snapchat video from inside the Bible study that night. In that brief clip, recorded just minutes before the shooting began, Ruth is visible sitting at the table with the group. The video was entered into evidence at the federal trial. Ruth was arrested the following morning in Shelby, North Carolina. A motorist had spotted his car, recognized it from news coverage, and called police. Officers found him without resistance. He had his weapon and multiple loaded magazines. Investigators later found a manifesto on his computer, along with photographs of him posing with Confederate battle flags. He told investigators during questioning that he had almost abandoned the plan because everyone at the church had been so kind to him. He had sat with them for 40 minutes and received their warmth and their welcome, and he had killed them anyway. The federal charges against Ruth totaled 33 counts, including 9 counts of hate crime murder and obstruction of religion resulting in death. The trial began in December 2016. Ruth chose to represent himself during significant portions of the proceedings, conducting cross-examination with careful and controlled questioning and displaying no visible emotion throughout. He called no witnesses. During the penalty phase, still representing himself, he told the jury he was not going to give them the pleasure of hearing him beg for his life, that he had no reason to feel remorse, and that he still believed what he believed. Felicia Sanders was the prosecution's first witness. She sat in the witness stand in the Charleston Federal Courthouse and described what had happened in the basement in specific, measured terms. She described the moment the shooting began. She described pulling her granddaughter down and pressing her face against her body. She described hearing 77 shots. She described watching Tywansa stand up wounded. She described what he said and what Ruth said back. She described watching her son die. During cross-examination, the defense attorney asked her one question. What else did Ruth say that night? She replied, "He said he was going to kill himself." She said she had been counting on that. Then she looked directly at Ruth and told the court that he was evil, that there was no place on earth for him except the pit of hell. The defense moved for a mistrial on the grounds that her statement was prejudicial. The judge denied the motion, ruling that the comment was a religious expression and not a sentencing directive. During the penalty phase, Felicia returned to the stand to speak about who Tywansa had been as a person. She described a time she had undergone a 9-hour cancer surgery. Tywansa had refused to leave the hospital waiting room for the entire duration. He had studied the recovery process beforehand, so he would understand what she would need. When she was back home, He sat beside her bed and told her stories. When she had healed enough, he told her it was time for boot camp and helped her rebuild her strength. A photograph shown in court that day showed him walking with her over a bridge, holding her hand. Tywanza Sanders, 26 years old, who wrote poetry and cut hair and stood up wounded in a church basement to ask a gunman why he was doing this, had spent 9 hours in a hospital waiting room for his mother, rather than leave. Felicia brought these details into the courtroom, where the man who had killed him sat watching the wall. She said, "Tywanza Sanders was my son, but Tywanza Sanders was my hero. Tywanza was my hero. May God have mercy on you." The jury convicted Roof on all 33 federal counts after deliberating for less than 3 hours. He was sentenced to death in January 2017, becoming the first person in United States history to receive a federal death sentence for a hate crime. In the South Carolina state proceedings that followed, he pleaded guilty to 9 counts of murder in exchange for the removal of a second potential death sentence. He received 9 consecutive life sentences in that proceeding, plus additional time for attempted murder and weapons charges. Roof remains on federal death row. His appeals have continued since 2017 and are ongoing. As of the time of writing, he has not been executed. Felicia Sanders has spoken publicly on many occasions in the years since June 17, 2015. She has described being unable to return to Emmanuel, AME, for an extended period after the killings. She has described what certain sounds still do to her. She has described what it means to live in a world where Dylan Roof is still alive, and her son Tywanza is not. And she has described it without softening it. The Emmanuel AME Church was reopened within days of the massacre. The congregation refused to abandon the building. Services have continued there every week since June 2015. The church still stands on Calhoun Street in Charleston, South Carolina, and it is still in use. 12 people sat down to Bible study in its basement on the evening of June 17, 2015. 9 of them did not come home. One of the 3 who survived held her granddaughter against her body on a blood-soaked floor for the duration of 77 shots and did not let go. Tywanza Sanders was 26 years old. He was wounded and he stood up anyway. He asked Dylan Roof why he was doing this, and Roof shot him 5 more times. Felicia Sanders watched every moment of it from the floor. Her granddaughter was 11 years old and pressed against her grandmother's ribs and alive because Felicia Sanders made a decision and kept it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Felicia Sanders held her granddaughter through 77 shots and survived a night that took her son, her aunt, and 7 others. The next case begins differently, not during a massacre, but on the quiet morning after one, when a grandmother arrived at her son's house and found a purse lying in the yard with its contents scattered across the grass. Case 2. Connie Bennett. The birthday party for Melissa Bennett had been held on Sunday, January 15, 1984. Connie Bennett had come over to celebrate with her son Bruce's family, the way she often did for the children's birthdays. The detail she gave when she testified about that evening, nearly 4 decades later in an Arapahoe County courtroom, was specific and domestic. She had brought Melissa an organ as a gift. There had been cake and ice cream. The family had gathered in the way families gather around a child turning a year older, briefly and warmly, and without any sense that the evening was anything other than what it was. Connie went home afterward. Nothing about the night suggested any reason not to. Bruce Bennett was 27 years old. He was a Navy veteran who had served as a sonar analyst before leaving the service and returning to Colorado to build a civilian life with the woman he had married. He and his wife Deborah, 26, had recently bought their first home together, a house on South Ursula Street in Aurora. They had 2 daughters, Melissa, who had just turned 8, and Vanessa, who was 3. Bruce worked alongside his family at the furniture business where Connie also worked. He and Deborah were reliable people in the specific way that matters most to the people who depend on them. They showed up. They called when they were not going to be somewhere. They did not go silent. The next morning, Monday, January 16, 1984, Bruce and Deborah did not show up for work at the furniture store. They did not call. The store tried to reach them. No one answered. Connie was notified. She tried to reach them herself and could not. She drove to the house on South Ursula Street. When she pulled up and looked at the front yard, she saw Deborah's purse lying in the grass. The purse had been emptied. Its contents were scattered across the yard around it. Connie described this moment in her trial testimony with the precision of someone who has replayed it many thousands of times across many years. She saw the purse in the yard, and she knew. She went inside. Bruce was lying at the bottom of the staircase in a pool of blood. His throat had been cut. His head had been injured. He was dead. Connie fell to her knees on the floor beside him. She asked him what had happened. She testified to this in court at the age of 87, repeating those words in a room full of strangers more than 3.5 decades after the fact. She had fallen to her knees and asked her dead son what had happened to him. She called 911. When investigators arrived and searched the house, they found a scene that the prosecution would later describe at trial as an unspeakable act of violence. Deborah Bennett had been found in the master bedroom, where she had been subjected to a serious assault and fatally injured. Melissa, whose 8th birthday had been celebrated with cake and ice cream and an organ gift the night before, had been found in the bedroom she shared with her younger sister. She had also been subjected to a serious assault and fatally injured. She was 7 years old. Vanessa, 3 years old, was still alive. She had sustained severe injuries. She was unconscious and unresponsive. Paramedics transported her to hospital and placed her in a medically induced coma. No weapon was recovered at the scene. Based on the nature of the injuries to all 4 victims, investigators concluded the attack had been carried out with a tool. There was no sign of forced entry. Whoever came to that house on the night of January 15th or the early morning of January 16th had come through a door that was either unlocked or opened willingly. What Connie did not know as she sat beside her son on the floor of that house, waiting for ambulances and police cars, was that this was not the first time in January 1984 that someone had used a hammer to attack a household in the Denver metropolitan area. 11 days earlier, on January 4th, 1984, a man had slipped inside an Aurora home and used a hammer to beat a couple named James and Kimberly Horbenshield. James Horbenshield sustained a fractured skull. His wife suffered a concussion. Both survived. On the same day, a man with a hammer had attacked a flight attendant named Donna Home in the garage of her Aurora home and left her in a coma. She also survived. 6 days after those attacks, on January 10th, 1984, a 50-year-old woman named Patricia Louise Smith had been found sexually assaulted and beaten to death with a hammer in her Lakewood condominium, approximately 15 miles from Aurora. The hammer used on Patricia Smith had been left at the scene. Investigators at the time did not have the tools to connect these crimes to each other or to the Bennett murders 6 days later. They did not have a name. They did not have a face. They had the wounds and the weapon type and nothing else. The Bennett investigation produced no suspect. Aurora police worked the case. Evidence was collected and catalogued. Every available lead was pursued and exhausted. Eventually the case went cold in the way all cold cases go cold, not by any single decision, but by the gradual depletion of things left to try. Connie Bennett spent the following decades knowing her son had been murdered, knowing her daughter-in-law and 7-year-old granddaughter had been murdered, knowing Vanessa carried permanent injuries from that same night, and knowing that no one had ever been charged with any of it. Vanessa grew up. The damage from January 16, 1984 was permanent and serious, but she survived it. She eventually changed her surname to Schultz after marrying. She and Connie remained close across the decades, with the specific bond of 2 people who had been left behind by the same night. In 2001, Aurora investigators uploaded the DNA recovered from the Bennett crime scene to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System database. In 2010, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation developed a DNA profile from the Patricia Smith murder scene in Lakewood and found that it matched the DNA in the Bennett case. The same person had killed Patricia Smith on January 10th and Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa Bennett on January 16th. Investigators now knew the crimes were connected. They still did not have a name. The break came in 2018. A man named Alex Christopher Ewing had been imprisoned in Nevada since 1984. His path to that Nevada prison had been circuitous and violent. In early 1984, Ewing had been in Arizona, awaiting trial on a charge of attacking a sleeping man with a 25-pound piece of granite, having broken into his home through an open door. He was being transported in a jail van to a hearing when he escaped custody. He made his way to Nevada. On August 9, 1984, he attacked a couple in Henderson, Nevada, breaking into their bedroom and assaulting them with an axe handle. He was arrested, convicted of 2 counts of attempted murder and 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon, and sentenced to 110 years. He had been in the Nevada prison system ever since. Nevada law had previously prohibited compelling inmates to provide DNA samples. A change to that law resulted in Ewing's DNA being taken and uploaded to the FBI National Database. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation got the match the next day after the upload. Aurora Police Chief Nick Metz, when told the result, said publicly, "It sent a chill down my spine." Forensic biologist Cynthia Kramer, who testified at the Bennett trial about the DNA evidence, described the statistical probability of that genetic material belonging to anyone other than Ewing from one of the samples. She told the jury the probability of an unrelated person sharing that profile was 1 in 13 nonillion. For reference, that is the number 13 followed by 30 zeros. Ewing had told Colorado investigators during 2 interviews after the DNA match that he had lived in the Denver area in 1984 and had worked various construction jobs, including plumbing. When investigators showed him a photograph of Patricia Smith taken at her crime scene, he jumped back in his chair and stared at it. When confronted with the DNA evidence placing him at the scene, he said there had to be a mistake and offered no explanation for how his DNA could have been there. The extradition process from Nevada to Colorado took nearly 2 years. Ewing arrived in Colorado in early 2020. The preliminary hearing was held, and Connie Bennett appeared in court. She was 86 years old. She had waited 36 years for the moment when she would be in the same room as the man accused of killing her son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter. She gave almost 30 minutes of testimony. She described the birthday party. She described driving to the house. She described the purse in the yard. She described finding Bruce and falling to her knees. She described calling 911. She described arriving at the hospital and seeing Vanessa in the coma, her skull caved in, her jaw broken, her left side paralysed. When the district attorney asked her, at the conclusion of her testimony, to look at Ewing and say whether she had ever seen him before, she looked directly at him and said, "Not at all." She said she had only seen him in that courtroom. The trial began in July 2021. The prosecution built its case around the DNA evidence and the forensic link between the Bennett murders and the Patricia Smith killing. The defense challenged the handling of evidence across nearly 4 decades, noting that a hair found at the Bennett scene had been destroyed during early testing, and that some evidence records from the original investigation had not documented biological material that was later identified when investigators re-examined the preserved evidence. The defense argued these gaps created reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated, became temporarily deadlocked at the end of the first day, and received a judicial instruction to continue. They returned a verdict on August 5, 2021. Guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa Bennett. After the verdict was announced, Connie Bennett, now 87 years old, stood outside the courthouse and said, "I am very happy that it is all over. It has been a long time waiting for this." She said it was just like a weight had been lifted off. Sentencing was held on August 17, 2021. Connie and Vanessa Bennett Schultz both addressed the court. Judge Varley sentenced Ewing to 3 consecutive life sentences. Under the sentencing laws applicable to 1984 crimes, Ewing was technically eligible for parole consideration after serving 20 years, though prosecutors stated they would oppose any such attempt. In a second trial held in 2022, specifically for the murder of Patricia Louise Smith, Ewing was convicted of that killing as well and received additional sentencing. After the August 2021 sentencing, Connie and Vanessa walked out of the Arapahoe County Courthouse together. Cameras and reporters were waiting. Connie Bennett was 87 years old. She had outlived her son by 37 years. She had sat in the same room as the man who killed him. She had testified at 86 and again at 87, and she had shown up every time the legal process asked her to be somewhere. She and her granddaughter, who had been 3 years old in a coma with her skull beaten in, stood outside on a summer afternoon and spoke to the people waiting for them. Alex Christopher Ewing is currently serving multiple consecutive life sentences in Colorado. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Connie Bennett waited 37 years, and she showed up every time. The next grandmother called law enforcement herself within hours of her daughter going missing, told them she already knew who was responsible, and was right before the first body had even been found. Case 3. Sandra Ruzicek. Shanann Catherine Ruzicek was born in New Jersey and raised in Aberdeen, North Carolina, in Moore County, in the kind of modest, close-knit family where people looked after each other through difficult things. Her mother Sandra and her father Frank raised her and her younger brother Frankie in that house in Aberdeen, and the relationship between Sandra and her daughter was close in the way that some mother-daughter relationships become close, built through shared difficulty as much as through ordinary daily life. Shanann battled lupus from a young age. The condition complicated her pregnancies and defined parts of her adult health in ways that required sustained support. Sandra was part of that support system across many years. When Shanann met Christopher Lee Watts through a Facebook friend request in 2010, a fellow North Carolinian she had not previously known, Sandra watched the relationship develop with the attention of a mother who had been present for the harder chapters. Shanann was going through a particularly difficult health period when she and Christopher connected. The lupus diagnosis had pulled down the walls she kept up in ordinary circumstances, and she later told friends and family that the crisis had made her open in ways she might not otherwise have been. Christopher was patient and attentive. He showed up for her when she was not at her best. She fell in love with that. Sandra could see it working, could see Shanann becoming happy in a way the illness had made difficult. She saw how he behaved with her daughter during those early years. In the 2020 interview Sandra and Frank gave in December 2018, Sandra said of that period, "He was so in love with her." She said he did everything he could for her to make her happy. Frank told 2020 that he had considered Christopher like a son and that he had loved him. When the Watts family expressed reservations about the outspoken Shanann, Sandra and Frank stood beside their daughter through that friction. They attended the wedding in Charlotte, North Carolina in November 2012. They were grandparents to Bella Marie Watts when she was born in Colorado in 2013, and to Celeste Catherine Watts, nicknamed Cece, when she arrived in 2015. The family obituary, written in the days immediately after the murders, described what those births had meant. It noted that Shanann had been so excited to have her first baby girl that she spent every minute thanking God and taking care of her precious gift. Of Celeste, it said Shanann had been so excited to be able to have another child because of her battle with lupus that she had been determined to stay healthy, and that every moment with Celeste was a blessing because of how hard getting there had been. These were the children Sandra was a grandmother to. Gap-toothed grins and funny dances in the social media descriptions people used. Bella was 4 years old and had enough personality at 4 to fill a room. Celeste was 3 and known as Cece within the family. They had their own favourite things, their own ways of doing things, their own small, specific lives inside that house in Frederick, Colorado, 27 miles north of Denver. On Shanann's 34th birthday in January 2018, a video exists of Bella and Celeste singing happy birthday to their mother. Sandra was there that day, joining in via FaceTime on Shanann's phone, watching her granddaughters sing. Christopher can be heard in the background. That was 8 months before he killed all of them. In the summer of 2018, Shanann and the girls spent 6 weeks in North Carolina. They stayed with Sandra and Frank in Aberdeen from approximately early June until August 7th. It was a long visit, the kind that gave Sandra extended time with Bella and Celeste in the ordinary domestic closeness of a grandmother's house, and with the pregnancy that was producing Nico. During those 6 weeks, Christopher Watts was alone in the Frederick house. It was during this same period, in June 2018, that he began the affair with his co-worker Nicole Kessinger. Shanann was in North Carolina with her parents and her daughters, while her husband started constructing his exit from the life they had built together. During the North Carolina stay, Shanann told her mother she had noticed a change in Christopher. Sandra knew something was shifting between them. Shanann could feel it, but could not fully name it. After the family returned to Frederick on August 7th and Shanann left again on August 10th for a work training event in Scottsdale, Arizona, her friend Addie said Shanann had texted her saying Christopher had changed and did not want another baby. Friends who saw her in Arizona said she was not herself, that she was trying hard, but her mind and heart were really with what was happening in her marriage. Shanann was worried. She was 15 weeks pregnant, and she was worried about her marriage at the same time. She came home at 1:48 in the morning on August 13th. A colleague dropped her off. She went upstairs. She never came back down. Sandra Ruzucek was in North Carolina when her daughter was reported missing. The report came in on the morning of August 13th, made by Shanann's colleague and friend Nicole Atkinson, who had been unable to reach Shanann and had gone to the Frederick house and found her absent. Christopher was home. He gave investigators a version of events in which Shanann had left that morning, and he did not know where she was. He appeared on local television to plead for his family's return. He stood outside the house, looking into the camera. Sandra did not believe him for a moment. The day after the disappearance was reported, she called law enforcement directly. She told them Christopher was acting weird and out of the ordinary. She told them she suspected him. This was before any body had been found and before any evidence had been formally processed. Sandra Ruzucek, from more than 1,700 miles away, named the right person before the investigation had caught up with her certainty. There was something else Sandra had experienced in the early hours of August 13th, before any call came, before the disappearance was reported, before she knew anything had happened. She woke in the night from a dead sleep. She sat up at the foot of the bed. She described what happened next in exact terms. She felt a spear go through her forehead. She heard the Holy Spirit say her daughter's name. She said, "I felt my daughter's spirit the moment she died." She woke the whole house. She told Frank and Frankie that something was wrong with Shanann. Hours later, the call came. Frank Ruchek Sr. described watching the news footage of Christopher backing his truck into the garage at 5:17 in the morning, surveillance video that showed him walking back and forth, carrying bundles that investigators later concluded were his wife and daughters. He said he knew immediately. He said Shanann did not run away. He said she did not go out the back door. He said she would not have done that, and he knew it the moment he saw the footage. What Christopher had done in the hours between Shanann coming home and that surveillance footage was this. He strangled her in their bed. The family's attorney, Stephen Lambert, who discussed the details on Dr. Phil in March 2019 based on the February 2019 prison confession Christopher gave to investigators, described the sequence. Christopher told Shanann about the affair and told her he wanted a divorce. She told him he would not be seeing the children. He strangled her. Bella walked in and asked what he was doing with Mummy. He loaded his wife's body and his 2 living daughters into his truck and drove 45 minutes to the Anadarko oil field where he worked. What happened at the oil field was more specific and more terrible than the initial public record had conveyed. Christopher smothered Celeste first. He pushed her small body through one of the 8-inch circular hatches into a crude oil storage tank. Then he went back to his truck. Bella was in the back seat. She asked him what had happened to her sister. Then she asked, "Is the same thing going to happen to me as Cece?" Christopher smothered Bella using her favourite blanket. He dumped her body in the same tank. Bella had fought back. The autopsy showed defensive evidence of a struggle. Bella was 4 years old. She knew what was happening. She asked the question, and she knew the answer before she received it. Sandra and Frank Ruzucek received these details from their attorney before they were made public. Frankie Jr. said on Dr. Phil, "We were hoping it had happened in her sleep or something." He said they had not known, until that moment, that Bella had watched her sister die and then asked whether she was next. The family learned the details of the children's recovery through a phone call from law enforcement who described what they had found. Frank Jr. said it had been hard for the investigators to even tell them. He said everybody involved needed so much therapy after that. Sandra said she dreamed about it all the time. She said it was the work of the devil. She also said on Dr. Phil that she was haunted every day of her life by what Shanann and Bella and Celeste had been thinking at the end. She said, Our daughter watched her husband kill her. She said she could not stop thinking about what it had been like for Shanann, waking at 1:48 in the morning in her own bed, in her own house. She said she believed her granddaughters had been screaming for their mum, and for her, and for Frank. She said she did not know how much worse a thing a person could hear than knowing their granddaughter watched her sister die and then begged for her life. She also said something else, quietly and clearly. Our daughter would have made it without his help. She said Shanann did not need Christopher Watts to survive. Shanann had battled lupus through 2 pregnancies, had rebuilt the family's finances after a Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing in June 2015 that documented a $3,000 monthly mortgage and more than $600 in monthly car payments, had built a social media following and a genuine income around her work selling health supplements for Level's Thrive program. She had called Christopher her rock on social media. She had posted photos of beach vacations and their daughter's gap-toothed grins and the text messages he sent her. She had done all of this with her own effort and her own will. The person holding that family together, Sandra knew from every chapter she had witnessed, was Shanann. Christopher Watts was arrested on August 15, 2018. He pleaded guilty on November 6, 2018, to 9 felony counts. On November 19, 2018, he was sentenced in Weld County District Court to 5 consecutive life sentences, plus 48 years for the unlawful termination of the pregnancy, plus additional consecutive time for 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. He will never be eligible for parole. He is currently held at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. Sandra Rzucek stood in that courtroom on sentencing day and delivered her statement to Christopher directly. The words she spoke have been reported across many accounts, and she said them clearly and on the record. "We loved you like a son. We trusted you. Your faithful wife trusted you. Your children adored you, and they also trusted you. Your daughter Bella Marie sang a song proudly. She said, 'I do not know if you got to see it, but it was, "Daddy, you are my hero."' She said she had no idea who gave him the right to take their lives. She said she knew God and his mighty angels were there at that moment to bring them home to paradise. Frank Rzucek told the court, 'You disgust me.' He said life would never be the same without Shanann. In the years that followed, the harassment from online true crime communities became its own sustained ordeal. Theories about Shanann circulated, many of them false and damaging. Frank Rzucek issued a public statement in July 2019 describing the pain of the previous 11 months and saying he could not describe how horrible, cruel, and relentless the online abuse had been. In a Fox Nation documentary in early 2026, he described the same thing again, that the cruelty from strangers on the internet had added a layer of suffering onto a grief that was already incomprehensible. Sandra Rzucek also said on Dr. Phil that there had been moments, in the months after the murders, when she had felt like giving up entirely. She said that if it were not for her faith in God, she would not still be here. She said she could feel herself wanting to end her life, to go and be with Shanann and the girls, and that her faith was the only thing that had stopped her. She has continued to speak publicly about the case in the years since, has advocated for awareness of domestic abuse and toxic relationships, and has worked to ensure that Shanann's name is heard in contexts that exist separately from the man who killed her. The funerals for Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn Nico were held on September 1, 2018, at Sacred Heart Roman Catholic Church in Pinehurst, North Carolina, near Aberdeen, where Sandra and Frank live. They were brought home to be buried in the state where Shanann had grown up, in the community that had always been the center of the family's life before Frederick and Colorado had become home. Bella Marie Watts was 4 years old. Celeste Catherine Watts was 3 years old. Nico Watts was never born. Sandra Rzucek was in North Carolina, more than 1,700 miles away, when all 4 of them were killed on the same August morning by the man she had once described as so in love with her daughter that he did everything he could to make her happy. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sandra Rzucek named the right person before a single body had been found. The next grandmother has spent nearly 4 decades naming no one at all, because no one has ever been charged, and she is still looking. Case 4. Joanne Dardeen. Russell Keith Dardeen had been so careful with money his entire adult life that his mother Joanne could describe his frugality in specific terms. He was, she told journalists in later years, the kind of man who would buy 50-cent cans of soda and resell them at work for a small markup, pocketing the difference and putting it toward Peter's college fund. Peter was 2 years old. Keith had already started saving. That was the kind of father he was, and the kind of son Joanne had raised. Keith was 29 years old in November 1987. He had grown up in Mount Carmel in Wabash County, Illinois, and had moved south to the small community of Ina in Jefferson County for work. He was an operator at the Rend Lake Water Conservancy District, about 80 miles southeast of St. Louis, a job he approached with the same reliability he brought to everything else. His wife, Ruby Elaine Dardeen, was 30 years old. Elaine had grown up in the same area, and both of them went by their middle names, the way people often do in small communities where names carry family history. They had met and married in August 1979 in Albion, Illinois, and by 1987 they were living in a beige and white trailer home in the woods near Keith's job, raising Peter and expecting their second child. Elaine worked at an office supply store in Mount Vernon, the Jefferson County seat. Outside of work, they were the musical backbone of the ensemble at their local Baptist church, Keith singing lead vocals and Elaine at the piano. Everyone who knew them said the same things. No enemies, no dangerous associations, no debts that anyone knew of. A small amount of marijuana was later found in the home during the investigation, but investigators determined it was too small a quantity to suggest any involvement in dealing, and Joanne Dardeen had her own theory about that marijuana. She believed it had been left behind by whoever killed her son's family. Elaine was 7 to 8 months pregnant by November 1987. The couple had already chosen a name for the baby girl they were expecting, Casey. They were also in the process of listing the trailer for sale. There had been 15 homicides in Jefferson County in the preceding 2 years, an unusual and disturbing concentration of violence in a rural community of modest size. And Keith had told Joanne he wanted to move the family back to Mount Carmel, where he had grown up and where his parents still lived. He told her he would go even if he had not found a new job yet. He wanted to be somewhere safer. He never got the chance. On the weekend of November 14th, 1987, Keith and Elaine and Peter made the trip to Mount Carmel to visit Elaine's family. It was a normal family visit, the kind they made periodically to maintain the ties that living apart from both their home communities had required them to maintain deliberately. When they returned to Ina, Elaine called her family to let them know they were back home safely. It was the last time anyone outside that trailer heard from any of them. On November 18th, Keith did not report for his shift at the Rend Lake facility. His supervisor tried to reach him by phone and could not. Keith's divorced parents were contacted separately. Neither had heard from him. By evening, with no explanation for his absence, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department dispatched officers to the Dardeen residence. Don Dardeen, Keith's father, had driven down from Mount Carmel with a key to the trailer and met the deputies there. What they found inside was one of the most extreme crime scenes Jefferson County had ever processed. Elaine was on the waterbed, bound and gagged with duct tape. She had been beaten across the head with a baseball bat with such force that the trauma had sent her into premature labour. She had delivered Casey during or after the assault. Casey had been beaten with the same bat immediately after birth, before she could take more than a breath or two of air. She never had a chance to be in the world. Peter, 2 years old, had been beaten to death alongside his mother. His birthday was July 5th, 1984. He was 2 years and 4 months old. The baseball bat, identified as the murder weapon, had been traced. Keith had given it to Peter as a birthday present earlier that year. After killing all 3 of them, whoever had done this had arranged the bodies carefully on the waterbed and covered them with a blanket, tucking them in as though they were sleeping. Keith was not in the home. Investigators initially considered the possibility that he might be responsible. His car was found parked near the police station in the nearby town of Benton, which made no obvious sense for someone fleeing the scene of a crime. His body was found the next day in a wheat field approximately 1 mile from the trailer. He had been shot 3 times in the face with a rifle. He had also been sexually mutilated after death. Forensic examination established that he had been killed several hours before Elaine and the children, which meant that whoever had come to that trailer had first taken Keith, killed him elsewhere, and then returned to the home where his pregnant wife and 2-year-old son were alone and waiting. Joanne Dardeen was the one who had sent the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office to do the welfare check. Keith had not shown up for work, his supervisor had called, and the call had reached Joanne. She called the police. She sent them to her son's home. She had to be told what they found there. The investigation that followed was enormous by the standards of a rural county sheriff's department. 30 detectives worked the case full-time. They interviewed more than 100 people. They tracked down more than 1,000 leads, many of which came from anonymous tips provided by members of the public who were already frightened by the preceding 2 years of homicides in the area. Almost 150 individual items of evidence were labelled and catalogued. Many were sent to multiple labs for repeated testing. Jefferson County shared their files with the FBI Cold Case Unit. Because the bodies of both Keith and Elaine had been sexually mutilated, investigators brought in an expert on cult-related crimes to consult on the case. That angle was eliminated along with all the others. More than 20 thick binders labelled Dardeen came to exist in the Sheriff's Department files. Joanne established a relationship with investigators from the beginning. She called the department almost every day. She said later that she just called to find out if there was anything new, if anything was going on. She kept calling. She kept asking. She drove the case forward through the force of her own refusal to stop. Leads pointed toward and away from a dozen different theories. Investigators never found a motive they could verify. There had been no forced entry to the trailer. Nothing had been taken. The marijuana found on the premises was far too small a quantity to suggest any commercial activity. Joanne developed her own theories over the years, which she shared with investigators and journalists alike. That someone had wanted Keith to sell drugs and he had refused, and the murders were retribution. Or that someone had become obsessed with or attracted to Elaine and had become violent when she rejected them. Neither theory ever produced a named suspect. Investigators described the approach as standing in the centre of a clock, where every minute position on the face represented a different angle or motive, and every direction had to be followed out to its end. The DNA samples recovered from the victims were preserved and retained, but without a suspect profile to compare them against, they could not generate a match. In the year 2000, a drifter and confessed serial killer named Tommy Lynn Sells was arrested in Del Rio, Texas, after seriously injuring 2 young girls while they slept. Kayleen Harris, 13, passed away. Crystal Searles, 10, survived with severe injuries and was able to help create a composite sketch that led to Sells' identification and arrest. Following his arrest, Sells began claiming responsibility for an enormous number of unsolved cases across multiple states. He said he had harmed as many as 70 people during years of travelling and working as a carnival labourer. Among the crimes he named was the Dardeen family. His account of how he came to be at the Dardeen trailer varied. In some versions, he said he had met Keith at a gas station. In others, it was a truck stop or a pool hall. The common thread in his claims was that Keith had invited him home for dinner and a deeply inappropriate encounter involving both of them and the pregnant Elaine. Investigators pressed Sells for details that had not been made public about the Dardeen crime scene. He got questions about the position of Elaine's body wrong. He eventually guessed the correct answers, but the fact that he had needed multiple attempts, combined with the fact that the wrong details he initially provided could easily have been learned from news coverage, severely damaged the credibility of his claims. Investigators confirmed Sells had committed at least 22 murders, but the Dardeen case was never among the ones they could verify. Joanne Dardeen dismissed the story Sells was telling about her son. She said that Keith was far too protective of his family to have invited a stranger he met at a bar home for a dinner and a sexual proposition. She said the people who knew Keith, including herself, had no doubt this story was false. She said Keith would not let a young woman he did not know into the trailer to use the phone, let alone bring home a male stranger for an encounter involving his pregnant wife. She also said something else. When asked whether she wanted Sells to be executed before the connection to the Dardeen case was fully resolved, Tommy deserved to die for what he did, she told the Associated Press in April 2014, but I wanted him to stay alive until I know positively he didn't do it. Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection on April 3, 2014, at the Huntsville unit in Texas for the murder of Kayleen Harris. He died having never provided an account of the Dardeen killings that investigators could verify or that Joanne Dardeen found credible. After his execution, she said she was now certain that Tommy Sells had not done it. That meant whoever had killed Keith and Elaine and Peter and the newborn Casey was still unidentified and possibly still alive. Joanne gave a television interview with a local station in 2019 when she was 81 years old. The interviewer asked about the case and about what she had tried over the decades. She said, "There is not anything out there that I haven't done." She said she had tried everything. She was still talking to anyone who would listen. She was still saying her son's name and his family's names in any forum that would carry them. She had said to journalists at some point, in words that have been quoted across multiple accounts of the case, "I carried Keith for 9 months. I raised him. I worshipped the ground he walked on. He was a good man and a good father, and I will never give up." The Dardeen case remains officially open. The investigation has never been formally closed. The physical evidence preserved from 1987 includes DNA samples from the victims, but there has never been a suspect profile to compare them against. Advances in forensic genealogy, the same technology that solved other decades-old cases by building family trees from partial DNA samples and working backward to living relatives of unknown killers, represent the most credible remaining avenue for resolution. Whether that technology will eventually reach the Dardeen binders in the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department remains unknown. Keith, Elaine, Peter and Casey are buried at Graceland Cemetery in nearby Albion, Illinois. Casey is listed there, though she lived for only moments. Her name is on a headstone. Joanne knows where they are. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Joanne Dardeen has never had a conviction to hold on to, never had a name to put to what happened to her son's family, and at 81 years old was still saying she had tried everything and would never give up. The next grandmother got a conviction, but only after sitting through a trial where she had to hear what the final weeks and final days of 5 great-grandchildren had looked like. Case 5. Roberta Thornsbury. In the first days of August 2014, Roberta Thornsbury travelled to Atlanta, Georgia, to spend time with her grandson, Timothy Jones Jr., and his 5 young children. The visit had been arranged as a family gathering, the kind that required planning across distance. Roberta had been a significant presence in Timothy's life from his earliest years. When his mother developed severe mental illness and was unable to care for him as a young child, it was Roberta and her husband who stepped in and helped raise him. She called him her grandson. He had called her grandma for as long as he could remember. That relationship was real, built over decades of genuine closeness, and it had not diminished as Timothy grew into adulthood. The 5 children he was raising by 2014 were Roberta's great-grandchildren. They were Mira Gracie, 8 years old, Elias, 7, Nathan, 6, Gabriel, 2, and Abigail Elaine, 1. Timothy had sole custody of all 5 following the breakdown of his marriage to their mother, Amber Jones. He had primary physical custody under an informal arrangement. He was raising them in Lexington County, South Carolina, working in a field related to engineering, and presenting, at least externally, as a strict but engaged single father. His children attended Saxe-Gotha Elementary School. He coached their activities and drove them to school and picked them up from aftercare. When Timothy arrived at the Atlanta gathering, Roberta was alarmed by what she saw. He had lost weight that had not been there to lose. He was drenched in sweat in conditions that did not account for it. He was drinking and smoking, a departure from a man who had in recent years organised his daily life around an intense and strict personal interpretation of Christian scripture. He seemed fractured in a way she struggled to name. Something in his eyes was not what she recognised. She tried to take action. She asked Timothy if she and her husband could bring the 2 youngest children, Abigail and Gabriel, back to Mississippi with them. Abigail was 1 year old. Gabriel was 2. If she could get those 2 out, she thought, there would be time to figure out what was wrong with Timothy. He refused. He told her he could not be without his babies. Roberta accepted his answer. She left Atlanta without any of the children. She carried the discomfort of that visit with her and could not put it down. What she did not know and what the investigation would later reveal, was that Timothy Jones Jr. had been deteriorating for some time before that Atlanta meeting. The South Carolina Department of Social Services had received reports and opened investigations into him for child abuse twice in the months immediately preceding August 2014. A DSS caseworker had noted in a report that Jones did not want the children enrolled in public school because teachers were reporting bruising and other marks to authorities. The caseworker's written conclusion noted that the father appeared to be overwhelmed, that he was unable to maintain the home, but that the children appeared clean and dressed appropriately. That investigation had not been concluded before August 28th. On August 28, 2014, Timothy Jones Jr. smoked synthetic marijuana, a substance known as spice, or K2, multiple times throughout his workday to manage what he described as the stress of an impending project. He smoked it again at home before driving out to collect his children. He picked up Nathan, Elias and Mera from Sachs Gotha Elementary School's after-school program. He collected Abigail and Gabriel from a neighbour's house where they had been staying. He bought takeout food for dinner. He drove them home. That evening, Jones discovered a broken electrical outlet in the house. He accused 6-year-old Nathan of tampering with it. He had developed, according to the pattern established at trial, a belief that his children were conspiring against him, that they were trying to bring him down in various ways. He decided to punish Nathan. The punishment he chose was a military-style exercise circuit, push-ups, squats, and other calisthenics, repeated continuously, with Jones striking the boy with a belt whenever he slowed down. This went on for hours. Nathan was 6 years old. He was exhausted and dehydrated, and according to accounts presented at trial, begging for it to stop. Eventually he collapsed to the floor and did not get up. Jones went to check on Nathan later that night and shook him by the shoulders, demanding to know what had happened to the outlet. Nathan did not respond. Elias and Mera, who were present, confirmed what Jones already knew. Nathan was not breathing. He was dead. Jones's response in the hours that followed was documented in detail through his own subsequent confessions and through court testimony. He used his phone to search the internet for a violent scene from the film American History X, a scene depicting male-on-male prison rape, and began to fear what awaited him in prison as someone who had killed a child. He concluded that the other 4 children could not be allowed to live, not because of any religious conviction at that moment, but because, as he later said, he believed Amber would not properly care for them if he went to prison, and they would be better off dead than raised without adequate parents. At approximately 2 a.m, he took 8-year-old Mera with him to a nearby convenience store and bought 10 packs of cigarettes. He returned home. He then strangled Elias and Mera with his bare hands. He used a belt to strangle Abigail, who was 1 year old, and Gabriel, who was 2. He wrapped all 5 bodies in bedsheets and loaded them into his Cadillac Escalade. Over the following 8 days, Jones drove across South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. He attempted to overdose on spice after the killings, and when that failed, he drove without clear direction, considering at various points fleeing to Mexico or Las Vegas. Eventually, he drove into a rural wooded area near Camden, Alabama, and buried the children in plastic bags. On September 6, 2014, 9 days after the killings, Jones's ex-wife Amber reported the 5 children missing. She had been unable to reach him or them for days. Law enforcement entered Jones and all 5 children as missing persons in the National Crime Database. The same day, Jones was stopped at a public safety checkpoint in Mississippi. Officers found him driving under the influence. His car was blood-soaked. Bleach products and handwritten notes about how to kill and mutilate bodies were recovered from the vehicle. Jones confessed to the killings. He led investigators to the bodies in Alabama. They were found on September 9, 2014. Mera Gracie was 8 years old. Elias was 7. Nathan was 6. Gabriel was 2. Abigail was 1. Roberta Thornsbury had been in Atlanta a few weeks before any of this. She had tried to take the 2 youngest home with her and been refused. The trial took place in Lexington County in the spring and early summer of 2019, 5 years after the killings. Jones pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense presented psychiatric testimony establishing a history of mental illness in his family, his own documented neurological and psychological issues, and the role of synthetic marijuana in accelerating his deterioration. Expert witnesses described a man who had been losing grip on ordinary reality for some time before August 28th. The prosecution countered that Jones's actions throughout the night and the days that followed, the systematic killing of each child in sequence, the cross-state disposal of the bodies, his conversations with Mira at the convenience store at 2 a.m., his attempts to cover the crime, demonstrated deliberate and knowing conduct. Prosecutors called the teachers who had taught Nathan and his siblings at Saxe-Gotha Elementary. Kindergarten teacher Jonathan Stone testified that he had stopped sending home frowny-face behaviour reports for Nathan because the boy would return to school the next day extremely upset. Stone had reported marks on Nathan's neck to DSS. When Nathan found out about the report, he told Stone that his father had ripped his homework folder in half in response. These were the conditions in which these children were living. The school had reported concerns. DSS had investigated. The investigation had not concluded before August 28th. The jury convicted Timothy Jones Jr. on all 5 counts of murder on June 5, 2019, after deliberating for approximately 6 hours across 2 days. The sentencing phase began immediately after. On June 10, 2019, Roberta Thornsbury took the stand in the sentencing phase. Timothy Jones Jr. wiped his eyes while she testified. She told the court that she had lost not only her 5 great-grandchildren to her grandson's actions, but that her family had suffered other untimely deaths of children and grandchildren over the years as well. That grief had followed this family across a long stretch of time. When defense attorney Casey Secor asked her directly whether she believed the jury should sentence Timothy to death, she said, "No, God, no." She said she loved him. She said the family had been through enough, that she did not think they could take any more, that it had broken them so badly she thought an execution would be the final nail in the coffin. She wiped tears from her eyes while she said this. Timothy Jones Sr. also testified in the sentencing phase that same day. He removed his dress shirt and tie at the request of defense counsel and turned around so the jury could see his back. The faces of all 5 dead grandchildren had been tattooed there, each one a portrait. He told the jury he felt more responsible than anyone for what had happened. He described tearing down the swimming pool he had built in his backyard for the grandchildren to play in, because the sight of it had become unbearable after home video footage of him holding the 2 oldest children in floaties was shown during the trial. Jones himself did not testify, either during the guilt phase or the sentencing phase. He declined both times. The jury deliberated on the sentence and returned unanimously in favour of death. Under South Carolina law, any non-unanimous jury recommendation results in an automatic life sentence. This jury was unanimous. Timothy Jones Jr. was sentenced to death. The South Carolina Supreme Court heard his appeal and issued a decision in July 2023, upholding both the conviction and the death sentence. The court found that 2 evidentiary rulings by the trial judge had been erroneous, but concluded both errors were harmless and affirmed the outcome. Jones remains on South Carolina's death row. As of the time of writing, no execution date has been set. Roberta Thornsbury told a jury she loved her grandson and could not bear to lose him on top of losing the 5 children. The jury did not follow her request. She holds both of those things now. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Roberta Thornsbury asked a court for mercy for the man who killed her great-grandchildren, and the court said no. The next grandmother made no such request. She stood before a judge in 2026 and told him that 1,000 years would not be enough. Case 6. Bette Caridis. Jennifer Canero and her brother Keith had been born on the same calendar date, not twins, just the particular coincidence of 2 siblings sharing a birthday across different years. The kind of detail that becomes a thread in a family's ongoing conversation. A small recurring reason to mark the day together. Bette Caridis, Jennifer's mother and the grandmother of Jesse and Sophia, mentioned this at the sentencing hearing on May 19, 2026. She mentioned it alongside something else, that Jennifer and Keith had also died on the same date. November 20th, 2018 had taken both of them. They had shared a birthday, and now they shared a date of death. That detail carries a weight that ordinary language is not equipped to process, and Betty said it in open court while the man responsible for it sat at the defense table with a stone-cold expression and did not look at her. Before Betty ever walked into that courtroom, she had absorbed a second loss. Her husband, Vlasis Karidis, had died before the trial began. He had lived long enough to file a civil lawsuit against Paul Canero and to describe in legal documents the financial theft that had preceded the murders, but he had not lived to see the verdict. He had not lived to hear his grandson Jesse's name in a courtroom. He had not lived to watch Paul Canero receive 4 consecutive life sentences. Betty stood at the sentencing podium in May 2026, having already buried her husband on top of her daughter and her grandchildren, carrying all of it at once. Keith Canero and his wife Jennifer had built a substantial life in Colts Neck Township, one of the wealthier communities in Monmouth County, New Jersey. Their home at 15 Willowbrook Road was a sprawling mansion, the kind of property that required significant income to maintain. Keith had founded his IT consulting firm in 1989 when he was in his early 20s and had grown it over 3 decades into a business with real revenue and real clients. He and his older brother Paul had worked together for years, Paul holding a 10% ownership stake and later sharing equal ownership in a pest control company they acquired together in 2011. The two brothers ran their businesses from a shared office in Asbury Park. To anyone looking in from the outside, they were a family business that had succeeded together. The reality inside that business relationship was different and had been deteriorating for years. By the autumn of 2018, text messages recovered from Keith's Google Drive account showed the brothers exchanging increasingly anxious communications about money. In April 2018, the messages reflected worry about their IT company's last remaining major client. By September and November 2018, the tone had shifted to discussions about selling one or both companies. The businesses were in trouble. Paul's personal finances were in worse trouble than that. Prosecutors established at trial that Paul Canero had been stealing from the businesses and from his brother for an extended period. He was charged not only with the 4 murders, but with stealing $78,000 from Keith. He had been redirecting money from trust funds set up for Jesse and Sophia's education into accounts for his own children. He had charged personal expenses extensively to company accounts. Keith had paid $60,000 of his own money for Paul's daughter's college tuition when Paul failed to cover it. Paul was also the trustee of an account linked to a $3 million life insurance policy on Keith Canero. Prosecutors told the jury that faced with those financial consequences, faced with the prospect of exposure and accountability, Paul Canero had decided that wiping out his brother's family was the solution. The attack began in the early hours of November 20th, 2018. Paul disabled the security cameras at his own home and drove to Colts Neck under cover of darkness. He cut the power to the house at 15 Willowbrook Road. The surveillance camera inside the Canero garage had recorded a silhouette of a man moving outside the property before the power went out. The 16-minute clip ended at 2:51 a.m. when the house lost power. When Keith came outside, apparently to investigate or responding to the darkness, Paul shot him. Keith was found face down on the front lawn, the hood of a sweatshirt pulled over his head, a bullet hole in the hood. He had been shot 4 times in the head and once in the torso. Inside the house, Paul entered and killed Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia in sequence. Jennifer was shot in the head and stabbed in the torso. When her body was eventually removed from the fire, it had been burned so severely that her muscle structure was visible. Jesse was found in the kitchen. He was 11 years old and weighed 95 pounds. He had 5 stab wounds. 1 wound had passed through his forearm, which was pressed against his chest at the moment of impact, consistent with a child raising his arms to protect himself. A forensic pathologist later testified about the nature of those wounds and what they showed about Jesse's awareness in those final moments. Sophia was 8 years old and weighed 45 pounds. She had been stabbed 17 times. She had a stab wound to her left eye. Her carbon monoxide level at autopsy registered at 49%, well above the 40% threshold identified by the medical examiner as sufficient to cause death by smoke inhalation. Her official cause of death was recorded as sharp force injuries and smoke inhalation. She was alive when the fire Paul set inside the house reached her. A forensic pathologist testified that her wound pattern indicated she had been moving and attempting to dodge the knife when the blows landed. She was 8 years old and she was trying to get away. After setting the fire at Keith's Colts Neck mansion, Paul drove to his own home at 27 Tilton Drive in Ocean Township and set that house on fire as well, with his wife and 2 adult daughters inside. None of them were harmed. Paul and his family were at the Ocean Township police station when Keith's fire was being reported. Prosecutors argued the second fire was a deliberate staging, designed to make it appear that both Canero brothers had been targeted simultaneously by an unknown outside attacker, creating a fictional alternative suspect and directing investigators away from Paul. The linkage between the 2 fires was established quickly. Within days, the investigation had shifted, and Paul was charged initially with the Ocean Township arson, and then, on November 29, 2018, with 4 counts of murder for the deaths at Colts Neck. He maintained his innocence throughout the years of pre-trial proceedings that followed. The physical evidence against Paul was extensive and specific. DNA analysis connected him and his victims across multiple items. Sophia Canero's genetic material was identified on blood-stained jeans, recovered from a debris pile at Paul's Ocean Township home. It was also found on a black nitrile glove from the same pile. Jesse Canero's DNA was found on a separate pair of Levi's jeans from the same basement pile. Paul Canero's own DNA matched stains on an Eddie Bauer shirt in the same debris. DNA from Sophia matched material found on a kitchen knife recovered from the Colts Neck crime scene. 7 fired 9mm shell casings and an unfired round found at the Colts Neck scene matched a Sig Sauer pistol found at Paul's home. 5 bullets from the Colts Neck scene were matched to a separate barrel recovered from a backpack in Paul's Porsche Cayenne. The trial began January 12, 2026, in Monmouth County Superior Court, Judge Mark Lemieux presiding. It lasted 6 weeks. When photographs of Jesse's stab wounds were displayed for the jury, Paul Canero was seen dabbing at his eyes, a box of tissues beside him. When the medical examiner described Sophia's injuries in detail, including the wound to her left eye, the judge looked directly at Paul as he spoke. The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours on February 13, 2026, and returned guilty verdicts on all counts, including 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of felony murder for Jesse and Sophia, who were alive when the fire started. On May 19, 2026, Betty Caridis and her daughter Bonnie stood together at a podium in the centre of the Monmouth County courtroom. Paul Canero sat at the defence table and looked at the wall throughout both statements. He did not look at either of the women speaking to him. Betty told the court that Paul had slaughtered her beautiful family, that he had murdered his own brother, her daughter, and her grandchildren Jesse and Sophia, that he had stolen the source of joy and happiness in their lives and replaced it with bottomless sadness, sorrow, and grief. She said she wished she could have seen Jesse grow up. She said Sophia was beautiful. She said there was not an hour in the day that she did not think of them. She told the judge directly to remove this killer, this monster, from society for good. She said Paul represented the worst of humanity. She said he sat there with his evil soul, still not admitting what he had done. She said 1,000 years would not be enough. Bonnie Caridis told the court that an entire branch of her family had been erased 2 days before Thanksgiving. She said the calculation and selfishness required to look his own niece and nephew in the eyes and murder them was a level of evil beyond comprehension. She called Paul the Satan in that room. She said the children had been executed and tortured by someone who was supposed to be family, by Uncle Paul. She said she would give anything for one more moment with Jesse and Sophia. She said the family was grieving not only who they were, but who they would have become, all the milestones that would never happen. She said there was a permanent, agonizing void filled with pain, sorrow, and grief. She said she still believed she would wake up from a nightmare and find her little Sophia and Jesse and her sister and Keith back. Judge Lemieux sentenced Paul Canero to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 for each murder count, plus 8 years each on 2 counts of aggravated arson to run consecutively. He called the crimes cold, deliberate malice and a flat-out killing of innocent people. He described in court what had been done to Sophia: the stab wound to her left eye, the knife through her nasal cavity fracturing her sinus and penetrating her brain, another wound collapsing her lung, and he looked directly at Paul Canero while describing each one. He paused a moment before resuming. Monmouth County Prosecutor Raymond Santiago said outside the courthouse that the sentence demonstrated what happens to a person driven by greed, jealousy, and viciousness. He said Paul Canero would never see the light of day. Paul Canero is currently held in New Jersey state custody, serving 4 consecutive life sentences. He maintains his innocence. The Colts Neck property has since been sold. Jennifer and Keith Canero shared a birthday. They also share a date of death. Betty Karidis' husband Vlasis never saw any of this. She stood at that podium alone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Betty Karidis stood in that courtroom without her husband, having already buried him alongside everyone else she lost to this case. The next grandmother spent 3 years not knowing where her son and grandsons were buried, or even whether they were alive at all. Case 7. Susan Blake. Joseph Brian McStay was born on November 20th, 1969, in Akron, Ohio, to Patrick McStay and Susan Blake. He was the first of 2 sons. His brother Michael arrived later. Joseph grew up in a family described by those who knew him as warm and close-knit, and he carried that orientation toward family into his own adult life, in ways that were visible to everyone around him. He was known to the people in his life as Joey. He became an entrepreneur in his 30s, building a company called Earth-Inspired Products that designed and sold custom decorative indoor water fountains, the kind built to specification for hotels, office lobbies, and private homes. He was good at it. He knew how to translate what clients wanted into something physical and beautiful. In the winter of 2009, Joseph, his wife Summer, and their 2 young sons moved to Fallbrook, California, a small community in northern San Diego County that local promotional material described as the friendly village. It was a genuine description, in the sense that Fallbrook was the kind of place where people knew their neighbours, and where a young family with small children could feel settled and safe. The house on Avocado Vista Lane was newly built. Joseph was 40. Summer was 43. She was a licensed real estate agent, deeply engaged in helping other families find their homes in the same way she and Joseph had found theirs. Their older son, Gianni Giuseppe Martelli McStay, had been born on July 9, 2005, and was 4 years old by early 2010. Their younger son, Joseph Matteo Martelli McStay Jr., known in the family as Joey, had been born on January 31, 2007, and was 3. The 4 of them had moved to Fallbrook together at the start of what looked from any exterior vantage point like the beginning of a good chapter. Susan Blake was Joseph's mother and the grandmother of Gianni and Joey. She was not in Fallbrook on the evening of February 4, 2010. She was, like most people in Joseph's life, going about an ordinary evening with no reason to think anything was wrong. At some point that day, Joseph had made a phone call to his father, Patrick. He was in a hurry. He had a meeting to get to. It was the last phone call he made to his father. His last known call of any kind was to a man named Charles Ray Merritt, a welder who went by Chase and who helped Joseph build the custom fountain structures for his business. After 5:47 p.m. on February 4, 2010, all contact with Joseph McStay and his family stopped. Inside the house on Avocado Vista Lane, investigators who responded to a welfare check in the days following the disappearance found a house that looked like a family had stepped out mid-evening and simply not returned. There were 2 bowls of popcorn on the living room futon, uneaten. There were rotten eggs on the kitchen counter. The family's 2 dogs had been left in the backyard without food. Summer's prescription sunglasses were on the counter inside, which her own mother told investigators was significant because Summer could not see without them and would never have voluntarily left without them. There was no sign of a struggle anywhere in the house, no broken furniture, no blood, no evidence that anything violent had occurred inside. Whatever had happened to this family had not happened there. 4 days after the disappearance, the family's white 1996 Isuzu Trooper was found abandoned in a parking lot in San Ysidro, a small California community directly adjacent to the border crossing into Tijuana, Mexico. The proximity to the border immediately created a narrative that would dominate the early investigation. Surveillance footage from a border crossing camera captured what appeared to be a family of 4 crossing on foot into Mexico on February 8th, 4 days after the family was last heard from. Summer's internet browsing history on the family's home computer showed searches related to traveling to Mexico and to learning Spanish. The combination of the footage, the searches, and the car at the border led San Diego County Sheriff's investigators to eventually announce publicly in April 2013, more than 3 years after the disappearance, that they believed the McStays had gone to Mexico voluntarily. The FBI took over the case. The investigation appeared to have reached its conclusion as a missing persons case. Susan Blake did not believe this. Joseph called her regularly. He was close with his family. He would not simply disappear across an international border without contacting anyone. That was not the person she had raised and known across 4 decades. She said this and kept saying it. She was not the only family member who refused to accept the voluntary departure theory. Joseph's brother Michael, Patrick McStay, and Summer's relatives all maintained the same position. They knew these people. Something had happened to them. On November 11th, 2013, an off-road motorcyclist traveling through desert terrain near Victorville, California, in San Bernardino County, approximately 100 miles northeast of Fallbrook, came across disturbed earth in a remote area along a road. He reported it. Investigators were called. They found 2 shallow graves. 4 sets of remains were inside them. Joseph and his youngest son Joey had been buried together. Summer and Gianni had been buried together in a separate grave. A rusty sledgehammer was found at the scene alongside the bodies. The identification process took several weeks. Dental records confirmed that the adult remains were Joseph and Summer McStay. DNA testing on the 2 smaller sets of remains confirmed they were the boys. The cause of death for all 4 was blunt force trauma. Joseph McStay's skull had been shattered. Summer had been struck in the jaw. The boys, who were 4 and 3 years old when they were killed, had been beaten to death with that sledgehammer. A child's pants and a diaper were also found at the site. Susan Blake had waited 3 years and 9 months to know where her son was. She had spent nearly 4 years in the specific uncertainty of not knowing whether Joseph and Summer and the boys were alive or dead, in Mexico somewhere, or gone in some other way she could not identify. Now she knew. They had been in those shallow graves in the Mojave Desert since February 2010. They had been there the entire time. The investigation shifted entirely after the bodies were found. Detectives who had been working the case as a disappearance were now working 4 murders and looking at every person in Joseph McStay's life with fresh eyes. Charles Chase Merritt had been part of those early discussions from the beginning. He had positioned himself as a helpful figure in the investigation after the disappearance, presenting himself as someone who had been among the first to notice the family was gone and who was doing what he could to help. He had told investigators he believed he had been the last person to speak with Joseph by phone on February 4th. He had, in an interview after the disappearance, referred to the McStay family members in the past tense. A detective noted this at the time. Merritt's financial relationship with Joseph McStay was the thread that unravelled everything. Joseph had hired Merritt as a welder and fabricator to build the physical fountain structures for his clients. Over time, the relationship had curdled. Merritt had a significant gambling problem and had accumulated serious debt. Joseph had at one point lent Merritt money specifically to cover a gambling debt. By early 2010, Merritt owed Joseph more than $42,000. A third business associate named Daniel Kavanagh told investigators that Joseph had been discussing cutting Merritt out of the business entirely in the period immediately before the disappearance. Joseph had told friends that Merritt was doing shoddy work and taking money from him. An email sent just days before the family disappeared documented the overdue payments. In the days after the family vanished, Merritt had accessed Joseph's online business banking account and written checks totaling more than $21,000, all made out to himself and backdated or written to cover payments that Merritt claimed were owed. Investigators later found that he had also attempted to close the business's online bookkeeping account. Cell phone tower records placed Merritt's phone in the geographic area of the desert gravesite on the dates relevant to the burial. DNA recovered from the steering wheel and gear shift of the McStay family's abandoned Isuzu Trooper matched Merritt's genetic profile. and at Merritt's home, during a search warrant execution in October 2014, investigators found handwritten notes containing quotes about remorse, forgiveness, and murder. The notes were not explained. Merritt was arrested in November 2014. He pleaded not guilty. His defense argued throughout the case that investigators had fixed on him without adequately pursuing other possible suspects, including another business associate who also had financial dealings with Joseph. The trial began January 7, 2019, in San Bernardino County. It ran for 5 months and was streamed live by the Law and Crime Network. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, telling the jury from the opening statement that the how was they were beaten about the head and face until they died, and then they were taken 100 miles away from their home and buried in the desert. The prosecution argued that greed and greed's child fraud was the motive. They presented the financial records, the cell phone data, the DNA evidence, and the forensic details of the wounds to each victim. The defense countered that the evidence was circumstantial, that investigators had overlooked other suspects, and that the case had not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated and returned on June 10, 2019, with guilty verdicts on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The jury also found special circumstances of multiple murders, making Merritt eligible for the death penalty. The penalty phase followed immediately. After deliberation, the jury recommended death for the murders of Summer McStay and the 2 boys, and life without the possibility of parole for the murder of Joseph McStay. The distinction in penalties between Joseph and the rest of his family was a result of the specific circumstances of the killings as the jury evaluated them. Sentencing was scheduled for late 2019, but delayed into January 2020 by procedural motions. The hearing, when it came, extended across 2 days, consumed by a series of last-minute motions from Merritt and his attorney, challenging various aspects of the proceedings. Every motion was denied. On January 21, 2020, 6 members of the McStay family's extended circle delivered victim impact statements before Judge Michael Smith handed down the sentence. Summer McStay's sister, Tracy Russell, spoke first. She said she did not know if she could ever explain the impact this man had on her family. She said they were scarred for life. She said it had been almost 10 years and the pain had not subsided. She said, "Our family has already received a life sentence." She described her sister as someone who walked with passion and purpose. She said they would never again hear the voices of Summer or the boys. Summer's former husband, who had remained connected to the family, addressed Merritt directly and told him he would not forgive him. He said he wanted to psychologically mess him up for the rest of his time. Joseph McStay's mother, Susan Blake, stood and addressed the court. She began, "How do I begin to explain the horrific pain and suffering that we have gone through for almost 10 years? She said it was horrific, just horrific. Then she looked at Merritt and spoke to him directly. She called him a despicable, evil monster. She asked him how he could beat 2 precious little babies. She asked how scared they had been, Gianni and Joey, crying for their mummy and daddy. She said he had had a choice. She called him a low-life coward and a baby killer. Joseph's brother Michael also addressed the court, saying the world had been robbed of 4 beautiful souls and asking the judge not to reduce the sentence. Patrick McStay, Joseph's father and the grandfather of the boys, had spoken earlier in the proceedings at a different hearing. He had told Merritt he hoped he would burn in hell. Merritt spoke before sentencing. He maintained his innocence to the last. He said he had loved Joseph. He said he would never have hurt him in any way. He said he would never have raised his hand against a woman or a child. He said, "I did not do this thing." He lashed out at the prosecutors, accusing them of framing him, at witnesses he claimed had lied, and at the judge he said had allowed it all to happen. Judge Smith upheld the jury's recommendations. Charles Chase Merritt was sentenced to death for the murders of Summer McStay, Gianni McStay, and Joseph McStay Jr., and to life without the possibility of parole for the murder of Joseph McStay. He was ordered transferred to San Quentin State Prison. California Governor Gavin Newsom had signed a moratorium on executions in California in March 2019 that suspended all executions for the duration of his time in office. As of the time of writing, that moratorium remains in place, meaning Merritt sits on death row at San Quentin with no execution date set and no mechanism currently available to carry one out. Susan Blake lost her son Joseph and her grandsons Gianni and Joey on February 4, 2010. She spent 3 years and 9 months not knowing where they were. She sat through a 5-month trial. She delivered her statement in January 2020. Gianni McStay was 4 years old. Joseph McStay Jr. was 3 years old. They were in those shallow graves in the Mojave Desert for 3 years and 9 months before anyone found them. And their grandmother was alive the entire time they were there, not knowing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Susan Blake spent nearly 4 years not knowing where her son and grandsons were buried. The next grandmother knew exactly what had happened within hours. She had been there. She had been close enough to prevent it. She arrived 60 minutes too late. Case 8. Dora Yates. Dora Yates had come from Hermitage, Tennessee to Houston, Texas, originally for a visit that was supposed to last 1 week. That was in April 2001. She had come to see her son Russell, his wife Andrea, and their 5 children. She had intended to stay 7 days. She ended up staying for months. The reason she stayed was standing in front of her when she arrived. Andrea Yates was not the woman Dora recognized from previous visits. She was not herself in a way that could not be explained by tiredness or stress or the ordinary difficulty of raising 5 young children in a suburban Houston house. She was catatonic at times, sitting completely still while the world moved around her. She spoke to herself. She trembled. She scratched at her own scalp with such force and repetition that she had scratched it bald in places. She filled the bathtub in the middle of an ordinary day and stood over it without explanation. Dora asked her about that. Andrea said she might need it. Dora did not understand what she meant. This was not the first time Andrea Yates had been in crisis. Russell, whom everyone knew as Rusty, was a NASA engineer who had built a life with Andrea that looked, from any ordinary vantage point, like a devoted and purposeful family. Andrea had been a highly regarded nurse at MD Anderson Hospital in Houston before she resigned after their marriage. She had given up her career to homeschool their children and manage the household, and she had done it without complaint in the visible way that Rusty organised the family's life. They had 5 children: Noah, born in February 1994 and 7 years old by the summer of 2001, John, who was 5, Paul, who was 3, Luke, who was 2, and Mary, who was 6 months old. The children ranged in age from 6 months to 7 years, and Andrea was their primary caregiver every hour that Rusty was at NASA. Andrea had first broken badly in 1999 after the birth of Paul. She had attempted suicide twice during that period, once by swallowing pills and once by trying to use a knife on herself. She had been hospitalized. She had recovered enough to return to the household. She became pregnant again with Luke. After Luke was born in 2000, she broke again and was hospitalized again. Her doctors gave specific instructions. Andrea was not to be left alone with the children. The instructions were clear and direct, rooted in a clinical assessment of the danger she presented in her deteriorated state. The family made arrangements accordingly. Rusty's mother, Dora, came from Tennessee. When Dora arrived in April 2001, she had intended to stay a week. She found the situation serious enough that she stayed through the spring and into the summer. She was there when Andrea filled the bathtub in May and said she might need it. What Dora did not know, and what would only emerge later in investigation and court testimony, was that Andrea had told investigators and subsequently testified that on that day in May, she had actually planned to drown the children. She had filled the tub with that intention, and then, standing over it, had decided against it, for reasons she could not articulate, in ways that satisfied any psychiatric framework. She was hospitalized again the following day after a scheduled doctor's appointment, where her treating psychiatrist, Dr. Mohammed Saeed, determined she was probably suicidal. He assumed she had filled the bathtub, intending to drown herself. He did not know about the children. After 10 days in Devereaux Hospital for that admission, Andrea was discharged. Dr. Saeed had told Rusty directly and explicitly that Andrea was not to be left alone with the children under any circumstances, citing her hallucinations and paranoia. The arrangement with Dora was how that instruction was meant to be followed. Rusty left for work each morning at approximately 9 a.m. Dora arrived at the house at approximately 10 a.m. In the hour between those 2 points, Andrea was alone with Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. On June 20th, 2001, Rusty left for work at 9 a.m. Dora was expected at 10. In the hour between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m., Andrea Yates drowned all 5 of her children in the family bathtub. She filled the tub with water. She brought Luke, 2 years old, into the bathroom first and drowned him. She drowned Paul, 3 years old, next. She drowned John, 5 years old, after him. She drowned Mary, 6 months old, and left Mary's body floating in the tub while she laid the 4 younger boys on the master bed and covered them with a blanket, arranging them as though they were sleeping. She returned to the bathroom. Noah, 7 years old, walked in and found Mary floating. He turned and ran. He ran through the house. He was 7 years old and running through his own home while his mother came after him. She caught him. She brought him back to the bathroom and drowned him in the same water where his baby sister's body was still floating. She left Noah face down in the bathtub. When police arrived that day, responding to Andrea's own 911 call, the first officer through the door found Noah exactly that way, face down and bobbing in the water. The officer who described this publicly in later years said that was the moment he understood what had happened in that house. Officers who processed the scene that morning were visibly crying. A police video recorded that day showed a wet sock in the hallway outside the bathroom door, a small piece of domestic evidence that carried its own weight. Andrea came to the door when police arrived. Her hair was wet, her clothes were wet. She looked directly at the officers and said, "I killed my kids." She was calm. She was arrested on the scene. Rusty Yates received a phone call from Andrea while he was at work at NASA. She told him to come home right away. She did not tell him why. When Rusty arrived and came toward the house, running, he was intercepted before he could go inside and was told by officers that all 5 of his children were dead. Houston Police Sergeant David Svan testified at trial that Russell Yates had run up to the house screaming after his wife's call. Svan said he had the grim task of informing Yates that his children, who ranged in age from 6 months to 7 years, were all gone. Dora Yates arrived at the house shortly after police. Everything she had come from Tennessee to help prevent had happened in the 60-minute window between Rusty's departure and her own arrival. She had spent months watching Andrea deteriorate. She had been in the bathroom with Andrea on the day in May when the tub was filled, and Andrea had said she might need it. She had watched the scratching and the trembling and the catatonic stillness and the self-directed murmuring. She had seen a woman coming apart at her foundations, and she had stayed and helped and done what she could within the limits of what she understood. She had arrived 60 minutes too late. The children were buried in a graveside service at a Houston cemetery on June 27, 2001. Russell Yates stood at Noah's casket and touched it. Neighbours in the Clear Lake community held a candlelight vigil outside the family's house on June 22nd, 2 days after the drownings. Andrea Yates had been taken from that house in handcuffs with wet hair. The legal proceedings that followed Andrea Yates's arrest were among the most closely watched and most debated criminal cases in American history at the time. She was charged with capital murder in the deaths of 3 of the 5 children, Noah, John, and Mary. Prosecutors chose these 3 counts because they were sufficient to pursue the maximum penalty without filing charges on all 5 deaths. Her defense was not guilty by reason of insanity. Her attorneys argued she had been suffering from severe postpartum psychosis and schizophrenia and had been genuinely unable to understand that drowning her children was wrong. She had believed she was possessed by Satan and that killing the children was the only way to save their souls from the devil inside her. She had believed she was a terrible mother who had already condemned her children to hell and that death was the only available mercy. The prosecution contested this entirely. They argued that Andrea Yates had understood exactly what she was doing and had understood that it was wrong. As evidence of this awareness, they pointed to the call to 911, to her calm and coherent responses when police arrived, to the fact that she had locked the front door after the drownings and had tidied the younger children's bodies on the bed before making the call. Dora Yates was the first family member to take the stand at the trial, which began in February 2002. She was called as a defense witness. She wiped her eyes in court as she described Andrea as her very precious daughter-in-law. She said Andrea had been catatonic and had not been herself for several months before the killings. She described the May tub-filling incident in direct testimony. She said she had asked Andrea what the tub was for, and Andrea had told her she might need it. She said she had not understood what this meant. She said Andrea had been pacing in circles through the house. She had been scratching her head to the point of drawing blood and creating bald patches. She had been standing motionless in front of the television while cartoons played for the children. She had been staring at walls. On the day before the drownings, June 19th, Dora testified Andrea had stood and stared at the cartoons while the children watched, showing no sign of registering anything in the room around her. The jury in the 2002 trial convicted Andrea Yates of capital murder after deliberating for less than 4 hours. They rejected the insanity defense. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The conviction did not survive appeal. In January 2005, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reversed the conviction and granted a new trial on the specific grounds of false testimony given by prosecution expert witness Park Dietz. Dietz had testified in the 2002 trial that a Law and Order television episode depicting a mother drowning her children and subsequently being found not guilty by reason of insanity had aired shortly before the Yates killings, implying Andrea had been influenced by it and therefore understood the cultural and legal meaning of her actions. That episode had never been produced. It did not exist. Dietz had made an error he had not caught and had not checked, and the defense had not caught it either. The Court of Appeals found that this false testimony had been capable of influencing the jury's decision and reversed the verdict. Dora Yates testified again at the 2006 retrial. She gave the same account in the same terms. The tub, the pacing, the scratching, the staring. The morning she was supposed to arrive at 10 a.m. The 2006 jury found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity on July 26, 2006. She was remanded to Kerrville State Hospital, a psychiatric facility in Kerrville, Texas, in January 2007. She has been there ever since. Under the Texas system governing not guilty by reason of insanity commitments, she is entitled to an annual hearing that could potentially lead to her release if she is found to no longer present a danger. Every year since her commitment, without exception, she has waived that right. As of the time of writing, she has spent more than a third of her entire life institutionalized. She has not sought release. Her attorney, George Parnham, who has represented her since the original trial, has said he speaks with her on a weekly basis. Rusty Yates divorced Andrea during her incarceration in 2004 and remarried in 2006. He has subsequently advocated publicly for greater awareness and research into postpartum psychosis. Dora Yates had come to Houston to stop something terrible from happening. She was from Hermitage, Tennessee. She had come a long way, and she had stayed a long time, and she had watched Andrea deteriorating every day she was there. She had done what a grandmother does when the family needs someone to show up and stay. She had stayed. She had been in the house on May 3rd when the tub was filled. She had asked why. She had been told she might need it, and had not understood the full weight of those 4 words. She had been due to arrive at 10 a.m. on June 20th, 2001. She arrived to find police cars, and her son screaming, and 5 grandchildren dead inside a house on a residential street in Clear Lake, Texas, in the full and ordinary light of a summer morning. Noah Yates was 7 years old. He found his baby sister floating in the bathtub, and he ran, and his mother caught him. He was drowned last, face down in the same water, with Mary beside him. Luke was 2 years old. Paul was 3. John was 5. Mary was 6 months old. Dora Yates had been 60 minutes away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Dora Yates arrived 60 minutes after her 5 grandchildren were drowned. The final case in this series is different in one specific way from every other case here. In this one, a grandmother's life was saved not by chance, not by circumstance, but by the deliberate action of a 15-year-old girl who had just been shot in the head and was lying on the floor surrounded by the bodies of her entire family. Case 9. Joyce Stay. Joyce Stay and her husband Tom had raised 3 sons on a farm in Southern California. Their youngest, Stephen, had grown up working the land alongside his father, and Tom would describe him in the days after his death as someone you could trust, someone responsible and kind, someone who loved animals and was very good in the garden. Stephen had become a man who took those qualities with him into adult life. He had moved to Texas some years before July 2014, settling with his wife Katie and their 5 children in Spring, a suburb of Houston in Harris County. They had lived in Moreno Valley, California before the Texas move, and before that in San Marcos, where both Stephen and Katie had grown up. Joyce and Tom had watched that life being built from Menifee, California, in the Sun City area, which was far enough away to require planning for visits, but close enough in spirit that the family had stayed genuinely connected. By July 2014, the Stay family on Leaflet Lane in Spring had 5 children. Cassidy was 15 years old, Brian was 13, and he had cerebral palsy. He had been described by family friends as a boy who ran with all his heart and who was always going to come and shake your hand, even though it was hard for him to do. Emily was 9, developmentally delayed, and described by those same friends as someone who loved her brother and her mama and her daddy. Rebecca was 7. Zachary was 4. Stephen and Katie Stay were known in their Spring community as people who showed up for others. They had become involved in a special needs baseball league in northwest Harris County called the Superstars, which gave children with disabilities the chance to play. They had agreed to take over the running of the league and were in the middle of that transition. A family friend described them as people who would have done it beautifully and with love, people who were not easy to replace. Their church was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Their community was wide and close and deeply attached to them. Katie Stay's sister was a woman named Melanie. She had been married to a man named Ronald Lee Haskell since 2002. The marriage had been violent from early on. In 2008, in Logan, Utah, Haskell had dragged Melanie out of their bedroom by her hair and hit her in the side of the head. He did it again the same evening, dragging her by the hair from the children's room. Their children were 3 and 5 years old at the time. Haskell was arrested for simple assault and domestic violence in the presence of children. He pleaded guilty in a legal arrangement that allowed him to complete probation and have the charges dismissed. The charges were dismissed. Melanie eventually fled Utah with her children to escape him. Katie helped her move to Texas. They hoped the distance would create safety. Melanie and Haskell divorced on February 14, 2014. He did not accept it. In the months that followed the divorce, his behaviour escalated in ways that were documented and reported, but not ultimately stopped. He violated a protective order that Melanie had obtained in October 2013, on the same day it was issued, by going to the children's school. He was not served properly and no charges were filed. In November 2013, he had grabbed his sister by the throat and thrown her to the ground. And then, on July 2, 2014, 1 week before the Stay massacre, he went to his mother Carla's home in California. He forced her into the garage. He taped her wrists together with duct tape and secured her arm to a chair. He choked her until she passed out. He told her he was going to kill her, her family, and any officer who tried to stop him. He was angry because she had been in contact with Melanie. Carla Haskell filed a domestic violence protective order the following day, on July 3, 2014. San Diego County Sheriff's detectives looked for Haskell in the days that followed. They did not find him. On July 9, 2014, Ronald Lee Haskell drove to Spring, Texas. He had been observing the Stay home on Leaflet Lane for 2 days before he approached it. He had obtained or fabricated a FedEx uniform and had grown a beard to change his appearance. He knocked on the door. Cassidy Stay, 15 years old, answered it. She did not recognize him at first. He told her he had a delivery and asked where her parents were. She told him they were not home. She turned him away. He left. He came back approximately 1 hour later. He kicked the door in. Inside the house with Cassidy were Brian, Emily, Rebecca, and Zachary. Haskell produced a semi-automatic weapon and ordered the children to the floor. He bound them. He held the gun on them and waited. When Stephen and Katie arrived home, he ordered them to the floor as well and bound them too. He demanded to know where Melanie was. He asked where she was living. He said if anyone told him where to find her, he would leave. Cassidy tried to reach him. She told him her siblings' names one by one. She told him their ages. She said later in court testimony that she was appealing to his humanity, that she did not believe someone would hurt children if they knew exactly how old they were. 4-year-old Zachary, 7-year-old Rebecca, 9-year-old Emily, 13-year-old Brian. She named them and told him their ages, and she asked him not to hurt them. He shot them all. He forced the family face down and went through the room one by one. Stephen was shot and killed. Katie was shot in the face as she tried to intervene to stop him. She was killed. Brian was shot and killed. Emily was shot and killed. Rebecca was shot and killed. Zachary was shot in the shoulder. The wound was survivable. Zachary, 4 years old and wounded, moved through the chaos on the floor toward his father on the couch and buried his head against his father's body for protection. His father was already dead. Haskell walked to Zachary, pressed the gun to the back of his head, and fired. Cassidy was shot in the head. The bullet grazed her skull and fractured it. She fell and lost consciousness. She also lost a finger when she raised her hand in the moment of the shot, and the bullet deflected through it, changing its trajectory enough to keep it from penetrating her brain. When she regained consciousness, the house was quiet, and Haskell was gone. She was lying on the floor. Her parents were dead. Brian was dead. Emily was dead. Rebecca was dead. Zachary was dead. She was 15 years old with a fractured skull and a missing finger, and she was alone in a house with the bodies of everyone she had grown up with. She called 911. During the call, she gave the operator everything she knew. She identified Haskell by name. She said he was her uncle. She described his vehicle, and she told the operator something critical. Before he had started shooting, Haskell had said he was going to go next to her grandparents' home on Anvil Drive to find Melanie there. She gave the address. Officers were immediately dispatched to intercept him. Haskell was stopped before he reached Joyce and Tom Stay. A high-speed chase followed, and then a standstill that lasted 3 hours, with a SWAT team surrounding his vehicle. Eventually he lowered the weapon he had been holding to his own head and surrendered. Roger Lyon, Katie's father and the maternal grandfather of the Stay children, said publicly in the days after the attack that without Cassidy's courage and quick thinking, they might have been mourning the deaths of 20 people, including himself and nearly all of his children and grandchildren. He said the number 20 specifically. He said it included himself. Joyce Stay received a phone call in Menifee, California. She was in the Sun City area, more than 1,400 miles from Leaflet Lane. Her youngest son was dead. Her daughter-in-law was dead. Brian was dead. Emily was dead. Rebecca was dead. Zachary was dead. Cassidy was in the hospital with a fractured skull and had lost a finger, and the man who had done it had been on his way to kill more of the family, when Cassidy, bleeding on the floor among the bodies, had made a phone call that stopped him. Joyce and Tom Stay sat down with a CBS affiliate in the Los Angeles area the day after the killings. They had not yet been to Texas. They were going to fly out to be with Cassidy. Tom described Stephen as someone who had worked alongside him on the farm, someone you could trust, responsible, kind, good with animals, good in the garden. Joyce described Katie and Stephen's marriage. Totally wonderful, she said, so committed to each other, all on the same page at the same time doing what they were supposed to do. She said if they could do anything to help anybody else, they would go out of their way to do it. Joyce had known Ronald Haskell and his family for years. Stephen and Katie had both grown up in San Marcos, where the Haskells had also lived, and the families had known each other in the ordinary way of people from the same community. Tom said Ronald had been brought up in a good family, that they had taught him the gospel, that he had understood what was right and wrong. He said he did not know what triggers something like that in a person's mind. Joyce said she planned to call Haskell's mother Carla, who was also a family acquaintance. She said she was going to give her sympathies. She said they had to find a way to forgive, even though 6 of their children had been taken from them. She said it was a process, and they could do it. Joyce described the first conversation she had with Cassidy from the hospital. She told her how sorry she was for everything that had happened, and how grateful she was that Cassidy was still there with them. Cassidy told her grandmother that her mum and dad were in a better place. Joyce said she told her she knew that, and that she would get through it. The funerals for Stephen, Katie, Brian, Emily, Rebecca and Zachary were held at the family's Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Spring on July 16, 2014. They were buried together in the community they had built their lives in. Cassidy was discharged from hospital on July 12th, 3 days after the attack. She made her first public appearance the same day, speaking to hundreds of neighbours and friends and supporters at Lem Elementary School in Spring. She paraphrased a quote attributed to the fictional headmaster Albus Dumbledore from the Harry Potter books. "Happiness can be found even in the darkest of times, if one only remembers to turn on the light." She said she knew her family was in a much better place, and that she would be able to see them again one day. Ronald Lee Haskell's trial for the capital murder of Stephen, Katie, Brian, Emily, Rebecca and Zachary Stay did not begin until August 2019, 5 years after the killings. The delay included years of competency hearings and pre-trial proceedings. His defence argued severe mental illness and presented expert testimony that Haskell had been controlled by voices in his head, directing him to carry out the killings. Prosecution experts countered that the planning and preparation involved, the 2 days of surveillance, the disguise, the deliberate cross-state travel from California to Texas, and the methodical execution of each family member demonstrated full awareness of what he was doing and that it was wrong. Melanie Lyon, his ex-wife, testified that he had previously threatened to kill her family. Cassidy, then 20 years old, testified at the trial. She described answering the door, not recognizing him at first, the moment he forced his way back in, the binding, the waiting, the arrival of her parents, what she said to him, and then what he did. She told jurors she had tried to reach him by naming her siblings and telling him how old they were. She said she had been appealing to his humanity. She said she did not think someone would hurt children if they knew how old they were. The jury heard her say this about the man who had shot 4-year-old Zachary in the shoulder, watched the wounded child crawl to his dead father, and then shot him in the back of the head. The jury convicted Ronald Lee Haskell on all 6 counts of capital murder on September 26, 2019, after deliberating for a matter of hours. At the punishment phase, they sentenced him to death on October 11, 2019. At sentencing, Cassidy addressed Haskell directly. She told him the jury had decided he would die by lethal injection and that she respected the decision. She said she hoped when he died, he would get the punishment he deserved from God. She told him she was going to continue living her life with happiness and moving forward, and she was going to forget about him. She told him he had been in control long enough, and now his game was up. She said he was not in control anymore. When the verdict in the punishment phase was read and the death sentence was confirmed, Cassidy bowed her head and clasped her hands as if in prayer. Then she looked up, wiped her eyes, and hugged the prosecutors. She told one of them in a loud whisper, "We did it." Ronald Lee Haskell is currently on Texas death row. Texas carries out executions with greater regularity than most other states with active death penalty statutes, though capital appeals take years to resolve. As of the time of writing, no execution date has been set. Joyce Stay lost her son Stephen, her daughter-in-law Katie, and her grandchildren Brian, Emily, Rebecca, and Zachary on July 9, 2014. Her granddaughter Cassidy, 15 years old and shot in the head, lying on a floor surrounded by the bodies of her parents and 4 siblings, chose to pick up a phone instead of waiting in silence. That call stopped Ronald Haskell from reaching Joyce and Tom Stay. Joyce is alive because a 15-year-old girl with a fractured skull and a missing finger made that decision. Cassidy Stay is now in her mid-20s. She is the last one left from the house on Leaflet Lane. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Dora Yates arrived 60 minutes too late to save her 5 grandchildren from the bathtub. The final case is different from every other case in this series in one specific way. The grandmother at the centre of it is alive today because a 15-year-old girl, shot in the head and lying on the floor surrounded by the bodies of her entire family, picked up a phone and made a call that stopped the killer from reaching her. Case 10. Geneva Roden. The Pike County Massacre is the largest homicide investigation in the history of the state of Ohio. It involved 8 murders carried out in the dark of a single night across 4 separate homes in rural Pike County in the Appalachian foothills of southern Ohio, approximately 75 miles south of Columbus. The victims were all related to each other or engaged to be married into the family. They were killed in their sleep, execution style, shot in the head, most of them in their beds. 3 small children who were present in those homes that night survived because the killers chose to leave them alive. A 4-day-old infant was found crying beside her dead mother. A 6-month-old boy was found covered in blood beside his parents. A 3-year-old boy answered the door when the bodies were discovered the following morning. Geneva Roden was the mother of Christopher Roden Sr. and Kenneth Roden. She was the grandmother of Clarence Roden, known as Frankie, Hannah Roden, and Christopher Roden Jr. All 5 of them were killed on the night of April 21st into the early morning of April 22nd, 2016. Her nephew Gary Roden was also among the dead. In a single night, Geneva Roden lost 2 sons, 3 grandchildren, and a nephew. She was not present at any of the 4 crime scenes. She woke to a world in which 6 of her family members were dead, killed in their sleep on their own property, and no one knew who had done it. The Roden family had lived in Pike County for years. Christopher Roden Sr. was 40 years old. He had been married to Dana Manley Roden, and the two had 3 children together, Frankie, Hannah, and Christopher Jr., before separating. On the night of the murders, the family members were spread across adjacent properties in a cluster of trailers near the community of Piketon. Kenneth Roden, 44, Christopher's older brother, lived nearby in a camper. Gary Roden, 38, a cousin, was also on the property. The younger generation, Frankie and his fiancée Hannah Gilly, and Hannah and Christopher Jr., lived in separate trailers on or near the same land. It was a family living in close proximity in the way that rural families often do, each household separate, but the overall structure a compound defined by bloodlines and proximity. The motive for the killings did not reveal itself immediately. In the weeks and months following the murders, investigators examined hundreds of leads across the region. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation logged more than 1,000 tips and conducted more than 500 interviews. The scale of the investigation was without precedent in the state's history. What eventually emerged, after 2.5 years of investigation, was a custody dispute. Hannah Roden, who was 19 years old when she was killed, had a daughter named Sophia with a young man named Edward Wagner, known as Jake. Jake Wagner was the son of George Wagner III, known as Billy, and his wife Angela Wagner. The Wagners and the Rodens had been acquainted for years. Jake and Hannah had a relationship that produced Sophia and then ended badly. Hannah refused to give the Wagners the custody arrangement they demanded. She sent a Facebook message to a friend 4 months before the massacre, which the Wagners had seen because they had hacked into her social media account. In that message, Hannah wrote that they would have to kill her first before she gave up Sophia. The Wagners took her at her word. Prosecutors established that in the early hours of April 22, 2016, Billy Wagner drove to Christopher Roden Sr.'s trailer on the pretense of a possible drug deal, with his 2 sons, Jake and George Wagner IV, hidden in the truck bed. The plan was to kill every member of the Roden family who might retaliate once Hannah was dead. The Wagners had reasoned that if they killed Hannah alone, the Roden family would figure out who had done it and come for them. The only way to be safe was to eliminate everyone. They killed Christopher Roden Sr. first, shooting him 9 times in the head, torso, and limbs. He was awake when the shooting began. He had defensive wounds on his body. He died at the scene alongside his cousin Gary, who was also killed there. Kenneth Roden, Christopher's older brother, was killed separately in his camper some miles away, shot once. In another trailer, Jake Wagner shot Dana Manley Roden, 37 years old. He shot her 16-year-old son, Christopher Jr. He shot her 19-year-old daughter, Hannah. After shooting Hannah, she slipped from her bed to the floor. Jake later testified about what he did next. He repositioned her body so that Hannah's 4-day-old daughter, Kylie, who was in the bed, could still reach her to breastfeed. He said it may not make sense, but that he had been concerned the infant would starve to death before anyone found them. Kylie was alive and crying when the bodies were discovered. She was 4 days old. In the trailer where Frankie Roden and his fiancée Hannah Gilly slept, both were shot in the head in their bed. Hannah had been nursing their 6-month-old son Ruger when she was killed. Ruger was found covered in blood beside her. Frankie also had a 3-year-old son who was in the trailer and survived. That toddler answered the door the following morning when family members arrived to check on the property. 8 people were dead. 3 children under the age of 1 year were alive. 1 3-year-old was alive. The Wagners drove home. The discovery was made the morning of April 22nd by Bobby Jo Manley, Dana Roden's sister, who had come to feed Christopher Sr.'s dogs. She found the bodies in the first trailer and called 911. She and her brother then found the bodies in the remaining locations. The 911 recording captured the moment she found the blood. "There's blood everywhere," she said. The responding officers found a crime scene of a scale they had never encountered. Investigators at first could not identify the perpetrators. The Wagner family was known to investigators as connected to the Rodens through the custody dispute over Sophia, but building a prosecutable case took years. During that time, the Wagners sold their property in Ohio and relocated to Alaska. The Ohio Attorney General's Office and Bureau of Criminal Investigation continued working. Search warrants were executed. Financial records were examined. Digital evidence was gathered. In November 2018, Attorney General Mike DeWine, who had just been elected governor, announced arrests. All 4 members of the Wagner family, Billy, Angela, Jake, and George Wagner IV, were charged with aggravated murder and related offences. Geneva Roden appeared in a video released by the Ohio Attorney General's Office in April 2017, 1 year after the murders, pleading publicly for anyone with information to come forward. She was surrounded by other family members. She said she was begging anyone with information to speak up. She said there had to be someone out there who knew something. Her daughter Teresa Grebbing, speaking alongside her in the same video, said her brothers had been good people who would have done anything to help anyone. That public plea was made more than a year before any arrest had been made. Geneva had lost her 2 sons and 3 grandchildren and still did not have a name to attach to what had happened. She spent more than 2.5 years in that condition. The legal proceedings that followed the 2018 arrests moved in stages. Jake Wagner pleaded guilty in April 2021 to aggravated murder and agreed to testify against his father and older brother. As part of his testimony in the trial of George Wagner IV, he admitted in detailed and largely unemotional terms to shooting 5 of the 8 victims himself. He described going through Dana Roden's trailer and shooting Dana, Christopher Jr. and Hannah. He described repositioning Hannah's body for the infant. He described shooting Frankie Roden and Hannah Gilly. He said he could not recall whether his brother George IV had entered the trailer with him. Angela Wagner also pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against George IV. She told the court she had initially opposed the plan to kill the Rodens, but had ultimately gone along with it when she became convinced that Hannah was harming Sophia. She said she had asked both her sons whether they still wanted to proceed, and both had said yes. The trial of George Wagner IV was the first full trial in the case. It ran for more than 10 weeks in Pike County Common Pleas Court in Waverly, Ohio, in the autumn of 2022. The jury convicted George Wagner IV on all counts of aggravated murder on December 1, 2022. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Billy Wagner, the patriarch of the Wagner family and the father of Jake and George IV, was the last defendant whose case remained unresolved as of the time of writing. His trial was scheduled for January 2025 and had been subject to further delays. As of 10 years after the massacre, in April 2026, his trial remained the final outstanding proceeding in the largest murder case in Ohio history. Chris and Dana Roden and their 3 children Frankie, Hannah, and Christopher Jr. are buried together at Scioto Burial Park in McDermott, Ohio. They share a hillside in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Geneva Roden lost 2 sons and 3 grandchildren in a single night in April 2016. She spent more than 2 years not knowing who had killed them, appearing in a public video to beg for information, waiting for answers in the middle of the largest criminal investigation her state had ever conducted. She was still alive when the answers came. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.